a grateful believer in Jesus Christ. I've overcome drugs and alcohol. I struggle with depression and anxiety, and my name is Ram. I want to welcome all the newcomers, those people who have been here once, or this is your first time. This is lesson 2 on Poweerless. And just for perspective, and I really want the newcomers, or those folks who have been here, if this is your first time, I know what it is like to walk into a place as though your life was hanging on a thread. So if I say anything that gets through to anyone, I pray that it at least gets through to you so that you are motivated to keep coming back, to feel that you are welcomed, that you have a place where you can be among family members. So just to give you a perspective of lesson 2, there are 25 lessons that apply to 8 principles and 12 steps. So principle 1, realize I am not God. I admit that I am powerless to control my tendency to do the wrong thing, that my life is unmanageable. Happy are those who know they are spiritually poor. Matthew 5:3. And the step that goes along with lesson 2, this is the second part of the first step. And again, there are 8 principles. They come from the Beatitudes, Jesus' most famous Sermon on the Mount. And from those 8 principles, the 12 steps were created, and Celebrate Recovery, when it came time to create a Christ-centered program of recovery, formulated a Christ-centered version to each step. So step 1, we admitted we were powerless over our addictions and compulsive behaviors, that our lives had become unmanageable. And the verse, for I know that God, that good itself does not dwell in me, that is, in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. Romans 7:18. And so there's an acrostic. An acrostic is basically, it's letters that correspond with the theme of the lesson, which is powerless. So P is for pride, O is only ifs, W is worry, E is escape, R is resentment, L is loneliness, E is emptiness, S is selfishness, and S is separation. So it took me a while to figure out all these things. So if you don't get it, let me tell you, a lot of people didn't. But tonight, the lesson that I'm going to be giving is on escape. By living in denial, the ERL of powerless, okay? So escape. By living in denial, we may have escaped into a world of fantasy and unrealistic expectations of ourselves and others. For light is capable of showing up everything for what it really is. It is even possible for light to turn the thing that it shines upon into light also. Ephesians 5:13-14. It seems that for myself, on the E of escape, as early as I can remember, I was trying to escape. I later on learned that my family life was sort of like a war zone, and there was always fighting. My mother these days would be considered a bipolar alcoholic, and if we were really to make it contemporary, She had sexual confusion, and that's putting it gently. So I was the youngest of three. I had two older sisters, and we had a two-bedroom apartment. I shared a room with my two sisters, and being the youngest, they were not doting older sisters. I was a pain in the butt. I did everything I could to avoid them and everyone. I mean, I didn't fully understand what was the chaos that was going on, but I knew that I didn't even know something was wrong. In retrospect, I did. There was a lot of head banging, a lot of self-destructive acts. When I was sent to nursery school, I was kicked out because they didn't like the way I rearranged the furniture, so to speak. I threw a chair at someone that went through the window. And then when I was in kindergarten, somehow or other, I would walk, instead of walking to school, I would walk to this hill. I grew up in New York City. I would walk to this hill that on one side of the hills were the alcoholics. On the other side of the hill, I would stay until I saw the kids walking back from nursery school. Eventually, they kind of caught on. Took a while, but they caught on, and that was really kind of the beginning of school for me. I didn't like it. I never felt connected. I never felt oriented. I did not feel like I fit in, and quite frankly, they didn't think I fit in. So between wanting to escape school, not fitting in, and really wanting to escape my home life, life was, for me, very dark. There were lots of self-destructive acts. My parents, you know, there were certain things they didn't understand, I guess. So what happened was I developed kind of like what I eventually came to learn was a dissociative disorder. You know, I separated a lot of the experiences that I had. If you can think back to the first lesson where we were speaking about denial, I was in complete denial. And the little formula, denial, or pain creates denial, and denial comes up with its variations of escape. And some of the escape, probably the most dominant form of escape that I had was developing a dissociative disorder, just separating from a lot of painful memories. And if you asked me, you know, how is everything doing? I'd say everything's good. You know, I really did not know. I could not separate events to an emotional, to a meaningful and accurate emotional experience. I barely graduated high school. They said at 4 o'clock, the day of graduation, they said I had to pass a test in order to participate in the graduation event for that night. And I took the test. I don't know if I passed. They said I did. They allowed me to graduate. They made a point of telling me I was, you know, 619 out of 632, which, you know, some years later, I statistically understood that was at the bottom. that placed me in an intellectually challenged category. It was called something different then. But I understood one thing. I wanted to get away as far away as I could. And I was a good athlete, and throughout my junior high years, when I finally stopped cutting school and through sixth grade, they said I couldn't play sports. Wow, it's 10 minutes already. Play sports if I didn't go to school. So, you know, I did go to school, and it didn't help my grades, but fortunately or unfortunately, my coaches got my grades changed. And so when I graduated, I realized that, I mean, there weren't any I was a good athlete. We were an all-state team, and I did well. But I knew there was no future in sports for me. So I thought, that I was able to get into a junior college, shockingly, in Cincinnati. And my major was retailing. I was going to work in my dad's liquor store. That's what I figured I would do. But I didn't want to be considered stupid anymore. And I said if I devoted all the discipline and focus on my academics, maybe I would. My one goal in life was not, other than, I wasn't even convinced I wanted to live, because there were multiple suicide attempts. And so, at any rate, I did well with my major of retailing, and I was able to, shockingly, transfer after 1 year to the University of Wisconsin. And I immediately went on probation, and so I realized that, and I had made their varsity soccer team as a sophomore, but I realized I couldn't, I had to stay in school. So fortunately, I met a philosophy professor who told me that, I could think. I didn't realize that, fast forward, I didn't realize I had dyslexia and I had ADHD. And so reading became a challenge for me. It was always a challenge. And always being lost in school, nobody knew. I'm 76, so nobody knew what was going on 70 years ago. Holy mackerel. But I started doing better and doing well. Long story short, I eventually graduated, and eventually I got into therapy. And that is when I started to realize what a dissociative disorder meant. And all of the painful experiences throughout started to surface, come out. And for the 6 years that I was in that form of therapy, the last session I had, I said, my goal for this session is to get through it without crying. It was 6 years worth of tears, and I couldn't get through that last session without crying, but I left, and so, in a short time, alcohol had become a big part of the escape. That was also a form of dissociation. And that became a bigger problem with time. So that's E, I was escaping. Everything I could do to run away, I could. So resentments. I got to a point where in my very sick mind thought that either my mother died or I died. It seemed that the relationship was so sick that they couldn't coexist. And fortunately, and by the grace of God, I realized I could just live as though she, and by extension, my father, died. So resentments act like an emotional cancer if they are allowed to fester and grow. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. Ephesians 4:26-27. Anyway, I lived for a long period of time as though my parents had died. And after several years, my dad called me and said, "Your mother wants to meet with you." And I had resisted I said no a number of times. We had not had any contact. And I eventually said, okay, I'll meet with her. It was, we met up at my dad's liquor store, and we drove to the cemetery to meet. My mother wanted to meet her mother and not meet her. I mean, her mother was dead, so she just pay a visit to her. And in that time, I had such sufficient separation from my mother. I no longer looked at her as though she had the power over me that she had. And she started telling me a little about her life, which I didn't know about. And she had grown up in what very, would be considered a brothel. Her mother was a single woman. She never knew her father. And there were multiple sexual assaults on her as a young girl. And I started to understand, and my mother, as I said, was a bipolar alcoholic with very sexually confused ideas, and lots of which confused me, let me assure you. And I started to have a different understanding of who she was, and eventually I came to understand what intergenerational trauma is. I couldn't put it together right at the moment, but I knew that, this is a very sad story. That was what I was hearing. But I did not see her much after that. I resented my sisters for having so deeply abusing me. It took me a while to sort a lot of things out. I shared a room with the three of them for probably about till 8, and then we moved, and I shared a room with one of my sisters till I was about 12, and trust me, there was no sign of a boy in that whole place. Needless to say, when you yourself aren't healthy, you don't make good decisions. And some years later, when I was trying to find a reason to live, I met a woman who needed a green card. And it was not the foundation for a marriage. We had 2 kids, and I eventually got sober. I eventually divorced her. We had 2 kids. I have a son who has 23 years of sobriety. Retired Navy, special operator. I have a daughter who committed suicide. So, loneliness. 30 seconds for loneliness. Probably at the depth of my darkness, if you will, I was estimating how long it would take people to identify that I was dead, who would be the first one. And I figured it would be the landlord after 3 months. And as I said, I grew up in New York City, and I was in New York City at the time, and I said, you know, for whatever reason, this is the way it got dealt to you and for you. And I mean, I remember it was like yesterday. It was a long time ago. I've been sober 39 years. But I was standing at a certain street and saying, okay, you know, I couldn't stay sober, and I couldn't stand not using to get rid of the thoughts of just, I used to say, if you weren't suicidal, you were in denial. So I took a walk. It was a cold day. It was like middle of December. I remember it like it was yesterday. And I found myself at St. Patrick's Cathedral, and I just went inside. I'd never been there before. I had no real foundation. And just sat there and looked up at the cross and tried to figure out, did they really do? I mean, I didn't understand anything about Christianity, but I was transfixed. And that word eventually came back to have a lot more meaning. I was just mesmerized, just staring up at the cross and him on the cross. And I left there feeling peaceful. The thoughts of dying had, for the moment, escaped. And those churches eventually became my escape. I didn't go on Sundays. I would just go during weekdays and sit in the pews in the various churches. And it started to grow on me. So loneliness. I know this. Isolation kills. Connection heals. And over time, I grew in my connection to Jesus Christ. I grew in understanding who he was. I grew in understanding that he loved me. I grew in understanding that he forgave me. I grew in understanding that he died for my sins. And I eventually came to believe that and say that the same, when I had nothing, he was all I had, and that was enough. And that has been true. That was a long time ago. That was a long time ago. A lot of darkness there. But the plan that he had for me, thank God I stayed around long enough to see how it played out. So I'd like to end with the principle one prayer. Dear God, your word tells me that I can't heal my hurts, hang-ups, and habits just saying that they are not there. Help me. Parts of my life, or all of my life, are out of control. I now know that I cannot fix myself. It seems that the harder I try to do the right thing, the more I struggle. Lord, I want to step out of denial into the truth. I pray for you to show me the way. In your Son's name I pray. Amen. Thank you for letting me share.